Happy Lambster and happy Easter, Prudentialist.
Happy Lambster and happy Easter, and I'll also add happy Palm Sunday.
Yes, indeed. Um, so we're talking about the world does not pause, and we're going to be thinking about geopolitics and international relations and all things which I don't feel uh, any real depth of understanding in, but I feel in very safe hands when I talk to you. So, um, and I suppose what we'll be talking about to some degree is actually meta geopolitics, right?
Just a tad, yeah.
Yeah, and wherever else this conversation leads us.
Of course, it can go anywhere. The world is our oyster.
So let's start with why is it important to study international relations? Why does this topic even matter?
So a lot of people, in my experience and also from my studies, kind of illustrate that you should focus always, of course, on the domestic, what's in front of you, because whether it's Cicero or even Oswald Spengler, they'll tell you that what happens at home is a reflection of how you carry yourself abroad. And the reason why you should have a healthy balance of both and why international relations in 2022 still matters is because so much of our world is so interconnected and globalized that the idea of other interests, other states, other cultures are going to have an impact on the well-being of not only your person, but your country, your people. And you should have at least a rudimentary grasp of how that operates and how that works. There are numerous schools of thought within it, and we can get into that. But I find it to be important simply because we don't live in a society anymore where things are far, far away. I mean, even right now with Ukraine is an excellent example. I was talking about this today because I had my show pre-recorded. I let it out today. That, you know, the thing in Russia and Ukraine can seem so far away to people in the United States, but, you know, food prices across the world are you know, dealing with high grain prices. And some nations like Lebanon are basically out of grain. They're out of bread. So these things are just, it's not one small, faraway conflict, a squabble about people we barely know. It affects the entire world.
It affects us, but can we affect it?
We can to some degree. I mean, not to some extent. I think my priest had said it best that, you know, we're not the diplomats, we're not the generals, we're not the Secretary of State, but by being aware of what your nation is doing, you can also be aware of the global impact and ramifications. And you as a consumer, you as someone who has that knowledge can sometimes profit or at least do well for yourself. So when the Russia-Ukraine thing kicked off, I put maybe $400 aside to like wheat futures and made a little bit of money from it. But I think that the reason why you can do something about it is that this information, this knowledge, can lead to protest. It can lead to making sure that your local constituency or township or government can at least insulate itself because there's more power that you have, you know, by proximity than you do abroad. And of course, by being wise to what's going to happen. I mean, the situation with COVID had affected supply chain issues, and the people that were smart about it who kind of knew what was going on we're telling people this is what you need to purchase and what to buy. So while we may not have a direct influence on it, we can also at the same time use this information and knowledge to better ourselves and be more prepared.
Because it's not cost free, is it? There's an emotional tax to hearing about suffering around the world. There's a time drain. There's a certain kind of stress involved in trying to understand things. So there's no such thing as a free lunch. You have to expend your resources to keep up with these things. So you mentioned people should have a rudimentary level of understanding of what's going on. Is there any way you can give us an idea of what do you consider rudimentary? How far do people need to know what's going on?
So this is why I find it so interesting to study international relations in 2022 is because so much of what is the traditional orthodoxy of how, you know, foreign policy and international relations works is also being questioned. But to have a rudimentary understanding, I think, is to understand that there is no global sovereign. There is no king of the world, earthly, right now, that tells all the nations how they're going to govern, what Russia is going to do, and what is the United States going to do. It's a very chaotic and anarchic system, but it's also incredibly complex. in this anarchy, because nations will look at themselves primarily as nation states and look at these governments, look at their organizations and institutions, and examine, okay, what are my constraints? What can I do? How can I secure myself? And it's a system of incentives, it's a system of constraint, and it's a system of working within the resources and demography that you have. And I think if you, for instance, live in the UK or even more in the United States, we kind of have this, privilege of empire, so to speak, that these things that seem so far off don't particularly affect us when they do. And if you understand some of these incentives, like, well, why are we dealing with some issues in Syria? Well, like, for instance, Semi-Agog and I had discussed not too long ago about the issue of pipelines and how that may affect America's interest in trying to export liquid natural gas to Europe. Understanding that, nations operate on incentives, they work within their constraints and try to use those as leverage or to take advantage of others, constraints is a good way to understand some of the ways in which nation states works.
How do we? How does one get that rudimentary understanding? So, taking the minimum amount of effort to get what's going on in the world, without falling into the trap that beginners can easily be fooled and misled. And there's obviously a giant incentive to do so. Like, there's surely enormous effort around the world going into deliberately misleading people about the geopolitical situation.
I think the person who had always said it best when it comes to this, of all people, was Frank Zappa. And he had an interview and he was talking about how he pays attention to the media and why he thinks that he needs to listen to all kinds of individuals. And, the reporter goes, well, don't you think that you're going to just fall into the spin that they're trying to give you? And he says, well, that's exactly the point. So you can listen to everyone and try and discern where the spin is coming from. That way you can kind of get that rudimentary sense, so to speak, of what is going on. So people ask me all the time, like, who do you read? What are your sources? And, outside of just academic papers, I do listen to media far outside of the West. I like listening to Arab sources. I like listening to what the Indian press has to say, because while everyone's going to have their own spin based off their political affiliation, their national affiliation, religious, and so on, you can at least get a good idea of where to come from. And then secondly, the other thing I would also emphasize is that you may not know, because you're not directly on the ground, especially with Russia and Ukraine, that you can examine second order effects to get a good idea of what's happening, how countries are responding, and what the fallout might be from that.
So what are the key incentives that matter to elites making decisions on a global scale? What are they at root? What do they care about?
Well, and that's the fun question that we kind of debate with politics, is, do these people genuinely believe in sort of the what they're huffing, or is it just that they've been high on their own supply, so to speak? And I think for a variety of things, there's always, of course, there's profit incentive. If you owned large swaths of a particular industry, you can control the flow of information, which allows you to achieve what you want. There's the sort of Machiavellian nature of power, especially when we talk about those that are major power players. So, I mean, the last 2 years alone, we've seen with, say, the WHO, for example. I mean, it's a little concerning when the World Health Organization is, the chief of it is tweeting out a picture of him holding How to Stop the Next Pandemic by Bill Gates, for example. Which kind of illustrates that there's this power, there's this influence that you want to put out, and other nations will respond in kind to it. There's a reason why, for instance, Mr. Gates is not very welcomed in India, for example.
Yeah, I guess there's that. There's that old trick for finding the truth where, when somebody grudgingly admits something, then that thing at least is probably true.
That, or when they openly brag about it. I mean, we kind of can tell when people are in power, when they can openly flaunt or flex, so to speak. I guess that's what the kids are saying these days about what they can get away with. I mean, I think, for example, when people, make fun of the sort of old man moments that the president of the United States is having, my take has just been, it's kind of a flex that the elites can just put in a senile old guy as the leader of the free world, so to speak. It just kind of shows you what kind of power these people have.
Yes. But for example, if you're trying to understand, I don't know, suppose there was some conflict and there was a number of deaths, and one side has an incentive to underestimate and one side has an incentive to overestimate, then it's reasonable to conclude that the actual number is between the two sort of stated numbers.
Yes, I think we can definitely take away from that between the Western and, say, Russian affiliated reporting when it comes to, say, casualty numbers. That's a good example, and it sort of adds again to that tragedy that you had mentioned, where we don't want to fall prey to, I think, what Dickens called a telescopic sympathy. It's important to sort of, again, judge and try and find something reasonably in the middle to find an answer.
What do you understand by the term realism?
So realism in international relations sort of has both a recent but also very long history. So there are plenty of, scholarly work that say that the idea of realism goes back to, like, Machiavelli, even earlier to the ancient Greeks. But more recently, it's considered a school of thought of international relations out of the post-war era. Hans Morgenthau is probably one of the most famous, seminal founders of realism. He wrote Politics Among Nations, I think in 1948, that sort of helps outline it. And it's the idea that, again, the world is sort of this chaotic, anarchic system, and that nation states examine where they are in terms of geographics, their constraints as a military, as a people, their governments, and how that impacts their relationship to other countries. And there are numerous breakdowns of how that school has evolved. More recently, you have what's called Neo-Realism or structural realism, most popularized by people like Kenneth Waltz or John J. Mearsheimer, who's been of particular infamy as of late due to what's going on in Russia and Ukraine. But it's that idea that it's a relatively amoral lens to examine how nations interact with one another. And it is mainly for the purposes of explaining rather than offering a prognostication or a predictive take on how nations are. And that's sort of been their response, is that realism can explain how, say, what caused the United States to take action in, say, Afghanistan rather than other places, or why the Obama administration made its pivot to Asia in 2011, more so than saying, oh, well, why didn't the realists predict that the Soviet Union would collapse? It's more focused on the interactions, the incentives, and mainly through an amoral lens, although it is aware of the political motivations behind nations.
So a little bit like how Austrian economics is a value-free analysis of what happens in a free market, and then it sort of says, well, do with this information as you will.
It pretty much, and it tries to explain it in a way that doesn't have it be focused on the morals, but we don't at the same time, completely throw out the moral or value-based system, because that's how nations do interact. For instance, John G. Eichenberry is a famous American political scientist and scholar, and he sort of has written that since 1945, the United States has operated on this, grand strategy of liberal hegemony, that if you can liberalize the world, then it's less likely that an illiberal system could challenge you and take advantage of your weaknesses. So the old adage, two nations with a McDonald's don't go to war with each other, although that's kind of been disproven.
Yes. Otherwise, there would be no war at this point. Everyone could be at war with North Korea.
Everyone could be at war with North Korea or their mobile scooter.
It feels like there's a great crossover in method between well done history and well done international, or trying to feel out what's going on in international relations, in that you're, well, I suppose at a basic level, history is just made of all the things that happened geopolitically that were once current affairs and became history. So you're just trying to move if you can study things from sources from 3 weeks ago, is that history or is that something that's ongoing? And if you can, now we can theoretically get access to a tweet milliseconds after it was sent, but that same tweet could be analyzed by historians in 50 years. So Are they the same tools to understand what's going on now versus in the past?
History is quintessential in understanding international relations. If you know the cultural or the political history of an identity or how a government has operated in the past, then you have a genuine sense of probably how they're going to operate in the present. And a good way to help contextualize things is through taking those tweets that happened milliseconds ago and trying to examine what were the public statements by governments, tsardoms, the Politburo, from say 50, 60 years ago, or even further if you wanted to go back to the Empire of Russia or even before that. It does help provide a great contextualizing tool as to, okay, why are they doing the things that they are doing? Well, we should examine history, and then of course we should also examine what have they been doing for the last 3 weeks. So it's sort of a very, you can have a linear way of sort of examining, looking back through time, how have they acted, how have they more recently acted, and what does the current statements reflect based on it? Is it a historical shift from their current policy? How much of a shift is it? Or is it a shift from 6 weeks ago? Is it a shift from 6 years ago, 60? These things are a really great tool to help us understand what is a significant departure and what is sort of business as usual.
Because to understand Putin's mindset, in some ways, you do have to go back more than 100 years in Russian history. But at what point can you draw a line and say, okay, 500 years ago really doesn't matter?
And that becomes sort of the interesting question, is how much does events from 500 years ago play a role? Of course, we have to consider the Russian people. We have to consider where they've come from. I don't want to make it entirely about Russia, Ukraine, right? But
no, it's obviously the one on everyone's mind right now.
Of course,
people rewatching this stream in a year are like, "This is so out of date."
I'm sure. I was looking back. I was putting together footage for Subscribestar, and my U.S. event speech had came out, but I had made a reference that people would be, shit posting on Twitter about Russia and Ukraine before the bombs dropped, and it was like days before the invasion had happened. I'm like, oh, this has been on our mind for months. But I mean, that's the thing, is that there are events from hundreds of years ago that do shape a national identity or a culture. I mean, we can talk about, for instance, like the United States, like Albion's Seed is a really good example of how events from hundreds of years ago can play a role about the identity of the American people, at least sort of the European stock that had came over. And that's sort of the idea that the late, Samuel P. Huntington had mentioned in his famous work in 1996, The Clash of Civilizations, that there are these events that shape civilizations, that shape them, and these blocks of people. So like the West is defined by things like Christianity, the Magna Carta, common law, and whereas you may have areas like the Middle East and North Africa that are primarily, ruled by sort of nomadic but also very Islamified, parts of the world. And that's sort of a clash that he talks about, for example. He says that, for the West, they wish to modernize Islam, whereas Islam looks at the West and it's like, no. We would like to Islamify modernity. So you can kind of see how those things from hundreds of years ago, because I mean, for instance, Muhammad died in 632 AD, right? And within 100 years, you're witnessing the Battle of Tours in 732, where Islam is spread not only throughout the Arabian Peninsula, but North Africa, and is now fighting in the Pyrenees Mountains of Europe. So events from very long ago can definitely shape areas, nations, and people.
And I suppose, talking of the Middle East, arguably the motivations of people to care about particular bits of Israel are based on what happened 2,000 years ago, or more. So to really understand, this is where it feels daunting. So I'm somebody who never took much interest in like geography at school, and so my knowledge of the countries on a map is pretty weak. And then I also was not taught history particularly well. So I feel like I've had to construct my entire understanding of the world over realistically the last 5 or 10 years. And there's a lot to get your head around. Every time you think you've understood a situation, there's another layer that appears, and you go, oh, I was missing the most important detail. And then you dig into that and you go, okay, right, I think I've understood everything that's going on here. And then something else will come to light. And it seems like this new lens is even more explanatory than anything you'd previously used. So this is why I'm asking these questions about, like, how far back do I need to go, and how many countries do I need to study? Like, do I need to know about every country in Africa individually? That, like, which European powers were they colonized by, and
That helps.
what
But
tribes were they previously, etc.
well, to some extent, but I mean, even
Okay.
myself, right? I've done numerous streams on the same subject because I'll cover something and I'll get feedback, or I'll see something in the news that's like, oh, well, this totally changes sort of my understanding of the topic. We should probably revisit it. Or perhaps I should get a different perspective from another nation's side and try to have them brought on. And that's one of the very nice things I've really enjoyed since doing content for international relations on the channel, is that I have so many people, whether it's on Telegram or Twitter, or supporters and channel members, that are from all over the world, whether they're Egyptian, whether they're from Poland, whether they're from Japan, and they'll just tell me, like, hey, this is what's going on from an on the ground perspective, and that's really helpful. But it's funny though, because, like, I'm an American, I have to catch up on geography very quickly, and it reminds me of that Mark Twain quote that God created war so that Americans would learn geography. And to some extent, I think that that's true after growing up in the last 20 years of living in the United States. But when you talk about
some countries are more significant to understand what's going on than others historically, right?
Oh, yes.
For example, the history of Panama, probably more important than the history of Costa Rica. Or not?
Well, yeah, that would be a very true example, because we started the construction of the Panama Canal, and that still is one of the most important trade routes in the world. Definitely more important.
That's what I mean. So,
yeah.
So it feels like if you started out a project of just figuring out about all the countries, you wouldn't know until you'd done quite a lot of investigation whether or not each country was really important on the global scale. And you would not expect Panama to matter until you learn the lens of, oh yeah, boats have to travel.
Yeah, right. Well, and you learn that all the time. Like, for instance, when I was prepping, all of this stuff about Ukraine throughout the last several months, like, I had no idea that most of the world's, like, semiconductor grade neon is produced by 2 companies in Ukraine, and now that they've shut down, and that's going to cause more supply line issues. I had no idea until I started, like, looking these things up. And then again, you will learn to prioritize where some of the things are. History, of course, is going to be your guide by larger powers, and that's sort of where geography plays a role, like which nations have been geographically successful by their location. It's just you're not going to get everything right, like, unless you dedicate your entire life, right, to, like, one particular nation, their particular policies, how they got to where they are. You're not going to know everything. And that's something that studying this and talking about it requires a substantial degree of humility. I'm never going to get things 100% right. If I don't know something completely, I'm going to tell them I'm not going to talk about this until I know. And if I want to know more about something, I'm going to ask someone to come on, and if they want to have a conversation. Today, I showed a video about Lebanon, and I brought in a gentleman named Hunger, who is not only a great supporter of the channel, but also, he's Lebanese, and he's got family there, and he's going to be in the country. So he was a really great person to talk to about what's going on there.
Is it a good idea to make predictions about the future?
Oh, this is where, if you are someone who's driven to, if you're surefire to know, and you have a good idea, if this is your craft, this is what you know, then potentially. I try my best to not make predictions, in part because, one, I don't think that I'm the voice of authority to be doing so, so I guess it's a bit of humility. But secondly, I think that the lens that I use to view the world is a better, like I mentioned earlier, an explanatory power than it is a predictive one. So, months ago, people were asking, like, oh, what about Russia, Ukraine? Like, are they going to invade? Or are they going to not? And I said, well, if it happens, X, Y, Z might occur. If it doesn't happen, then this is what might happen. I think that if you're after maybe the hot take sort of, content pipeline to just put it more into your veins, then by all means. But for me, I find that it's a lot better to watch things unfold, sort of like the 3 or 7 day rule for major events, and then try to contextualize it based upon what we know and make sense of it. And then potentially, with all of this extra background information, maybe then we can prognosticate a little bit.
It feels like there must be a method whereby you can make a prediction with a percentage, and then over time you will produce a metric that gives you some sense of whether you understand or not. You know, that it would be interesting to track various people and their predictions, and then that should give some credibility. You know, if they've correctly predicted things in the past, that they're then kind of reliable.
I bet you there probably is that metric. I'm sure someone out there has started going through people's work and said, "Oh, they got X, Y, and Z right. They're more reliable on this than others." But in fact, I mean, in international relations, there's a whole school of thought of like rational choice theory, where they're trying to apply the rational choice model in economics, and they're trying to apply it to conflict studies. So if you want to know more, I've done like 2 streams, this whole like aspect of how do nations calculate whether or not it's a good idea to go to war or negotiate a settlement. And I don't know how reliable this is because there's so many other predictive factors for war that people have to consider. But there are people that try and put percentages to the likelihood of things. And I mean, we see this all the time with betting markets too.
I would assume that according to rational choice theory, two nations would only go to war if they didn't already both have perfect information, right? Because what would be the point in the war?
Well, that's a part of it actually. Is that you can't rely that your potential opponent or partner is going to be 100% honest with you, and misinformation can occur that can lead to being drawn into a conflict that they may not win. And when they are sort of negotiating this out, you kind of have to think like, what's the ultimatum red line that you have to draw? And then weigh that against, well, what are my potential gains over the costs? Is there quote unquote profit? Am I going to gain something, territory, land, population, industry? And is that worth my time? Or if not, I'm going to lose a lot of men, equipment, capital, blood, and treasure. So it's a fun exercise, I think, to look at, but I don't know how reliable it can be, because what's the first casualty of war? It's always the plan. It's always the truth. It's always what you thought you knew,
I once had a very out there and probably ill-informed take that was that the analysis. Sorry, I'm trying to
no worries.
Trying to remember it / rephrase it. The analysis of the world that's based on the idea that countries truly own their own militaries is kind of misleading. And in fact, there are these kind of international elite cooperations and deals going on whereby, like, if you truly try to analyze things based on countries' individual interests, none of it would make any sense. But then if you realize that, oh well, this multinational needed more copper, so they did a few backroom deals, and now this country's invaded that other country. So how much of is there any possibility that type of thing is going on, or do you think the traditional kind of view of countries sort of defending land and their people is still largely holds true?
I think it's a synthesis of both. For instance, I think that it's very clear that in the United States, for example, there's certain companies, defense contractors, that will profit, and that also it has an impact on American foreign policy because it's an American company, or relatively American, that is now created, say, the F-35 program. And we had that whole F-35 at the beginning of the century, this partner program about which nations would receive it. And that's sort of under the American security umbrella. But we know that the companies involved in producing the F-35 Joint Strike Fighter are probably lobbying Congress to have this program going. And the same thing we can say throughout the history of, say, like the Cold War. We can talk about like the United Fruit Company. But at the same time, nations do have particular sets of interests. For instance, Russia has used natural gas and its energy resources, but we know that Gazprom, for example, is pretty much nationalized. It's a state-operated enterprise or state-owned enterprise. and that allows them to sort of have a little more control over things. But we do know, and again, it's why I said at the beginning, it's so interesting to study this stuff in the 21st century, because in 2022 there are large corporations with GDPs much large, with profitability and wealth that are greater than the GDPs of many European states. At the same time, this is something that Morgenthau and I have had long conversations back and forth about, because he posited the question: what would it look like for something like Amazon to declare war on the nation of France? Because it's not a state, but it has the capability to engage in a destructive warlike means to a nation state. And, the definition of a nation state has always been about like a collective group of people that could be a tax base, that are within a certain geographic region, that, can raise a military to defend itself and engage in international trade and is internationally recognized. And it's just like, you kind of sit there and think about Google or Alphabet or Amazon or BlackRock, and you're thinking to yourself, they're kind of getting very close to this traditional definition of what scholars determine as a nation state. And it gets a little concerning about, where does the sovereignty lie? Because these things are technically private, for-profit entities, but they have such an impact on international trade. And we've seen this with like Russia, where almost every company and their mother decided to stop services. But I mean, there are video footage saying, hey, the Burger King is still running. So who really knows?
But this is where my theory would have been that if Amazon wants to declare war on France, what you would actually see on the ground is a war between another, say, Germany and France. Right? Why has Germany invaded France? Well, they're telling us these supposed reasons about some treaty or the other, but the actual reason is that Amazon is paid for, to recruit Germany's fighting force for 3 weeks or whatever. like it's just a gentleman's club, and you can...
Oh, sure. I don't know if it would happen on such a level with the nation state. Heaven for... We may go down that line. I don't... If we get to that point, then all heck is broken loose. But I mean...
Probably Germany and France is a bit of a... particularly ridiculous.
The Anglo... I mean, the French-German rivalry is a pretty old one. So, I mean, who knows? But we do kind of see that. I mean, the United States or other countries will, support groups that are, private organizations that they don't have to directly link to them. But we know that they're funded or supported by us. Like in Syria, for example, we know that various Kurdish forces are supported by American and Western money, but there are still Kurdish forces, they're not a part of anyone's state, and other parts like that have been done so. But I don't think we've gotten yet to the degree where, the entire German military, the entire Bundeswehr has been bought out by Amazon for 3 weeks. I don't see that happening anytime soon. Maybe for smaller countries, as the current Chinese sort of dollar imperialism happens in Africa, who knows? Because they've recently had an entire international airport repoed to the Chinese state. So anything's possible at this point.
Yeah. And so what are the key... I feel like you could break down... If you want to understand the global situation, you have to look at multiple realms. So one would be control over land, and then also the properties of that land. So for example, is it a mountainous region? Is it arable? Is it near to the coast? What would you say are the key? Let's start with that then. What are the key properties in your mind when you're just looking on a map to understand like the physical geography of a place?
So geography would include, of course, things like the topography, like you had mentioned with mountains, their access to the oceans, access to arable land, so that usually includes rivers. And of course, the mineral wealth is a part of geography. If we know that a region is particularly rich in, say, oil or coal, we know that there's a likelihood that if they're developed, that's going to be a significant boon. If it's more natural resources like, lumber, for example, that's also a great aspect for exports. And I'm going to stop my camera for a second here so I can just shill a book. And this will be a great buying guide. So this is a little older, but this is the Strategic Atlas. This is from Jared Chaliand and Jean-Pierre Rageau. It's a little older. This one came out in 1991, but it's still incredibly valid to help you understand the globe geographically and how nations sort of view themselves, and how to just not look at the sort of usual map that we might see in a classroom, but also, as the image I had shown, is also from like the top of a globe, and how those nations are also geographically placed. Because, I mean, for example, how close are you to the Arctic or close to the ocean would impact your international trade as well. And for instance, because the Arctic is, we're seeing sea levels rise and ice melt for various reasons, that nations like Russia and China and the United States are looking at the Arctic and they're like, new trade routes, new military opportunities.
Okay, what else other than land should be included then? Because here's another whole black box to me that I don't know how to think about properly. Okay. And people tell me facts, and I don't know. I can't quite figure it out. So economics and currencies and who owes money to who in which amounts, and so some of the way that the economy works seems to be incredibly complicated, and then it gets boiled down into these sort of digestible numbers. But is that, do I need to dig into all the details, or can I trust some high level stats?
Well, so that comes back to the question of sources, right? So sometimes we kind of get skeptical of groups that we kind of consider shady. So for instance, like the Council of Foreign Relations is a really great place for bean counting, but sometimes I don't know how much I would like to trust their policy recommendations, because, there are some people in there that have ulterior motives, or at least have ideologies that are not beneficial to me. But however, it doesn't mean that the data that they can provide isn't reliable to use, or isn't something that I could look at and try and digest. And it goes back to the spin thing as well, that, okay, I have stats from the Council of Foreign Relations. I also have something from the United Nations. I have something from, OECD, all of these things that I can help sort of break down and understand. And sometimes you can look at some of the more raw numbers or things that governments put out as well. So, I mean, for example, when we take a look at Ethiopia as just an example, we notice that they have a very close relationship with the Chinese. There's a lot of investment in there, and the government probably wants to win the ongoing conflict that they're in, probably to, one, maintain sovereignty and power, but also because half of your foreign debt is to the Chinese, and you've also signed a security agreement with them to protect their assets and whatnot. So in risk of losing out on that investment and losing out on your sovereignty, you might want to win a conflict that you're currently fighting. That's an example. But again, it goes down to understanding how to read those numbers as well. But a lot of times it can be rather digestible that, things are not going too well in, say, Ukraine. They have a significant credit issue. That might be a reason why they want to encourage all of this foreign money to start pouring in, or something like that. There's plenty of examples that we've seen where financial, policy also has an influence on the foreign. I mean, there's a lot of talk about like the United States dollar and it being the global reserve currency, because that allows you to exert influence on the global market.
If there's a trade imbalance, which, as I understand it, is more or less always in every case, that one country is a net exporter to another, how does that affect the power imbalance?
So economic interdependence is the age-old question about nations going to war for economic reasons. And I think that the best sort of answer that I've read up on and have looked into, because there are some cases that will be made that stronger interdependence decreases the likelihood for conflict. Whereas other times it's just like, well, sometimes they may have that imbalance, and it's a power imbalance to such a degree that they feel the need to actually engage in war because that resource is too valuable to them. And some nations do it over, like, Alsace-Lorraine, like when Germany unified. That area was very rich in coal for industry. Why not take it from them? But I think the best answer I've recently heard is from a scholar named Dale Copeland. He wrote a book called Economic Interdependence and War, and his idea was, it's not about the relationship, it's about the expectation of trade. If they feel like the expectation of trade is going to continue and be this positive relationship, then the likelihood of conflict is probably not going to go kinetic and go hot. But if they expect things to go very badly and that nation state hasn't taken the necessary steps to prepare itself, then odds are a conflict is most likely going to happen. So I do think that in that lens, that the sort of trade expectation theory is probably the best lens to view it in.
How true is it that trade between two countries reduces the probability of them going to war?
I would say that I would look at it at a case-by-case basis, but I would argue that it's relatively true. I mean, again, it kind of goes back to what we said with the Austrian thing. It's value-free. Would take it with what you will. But when nations sort of engage in a voluntary exchange of goods, this is sort of the free trade argument that you get, that typically this increases, economic competition globally, that things are going to be more produced, more developed, and that's good for all the countries overall because I'm getting cheaper goods and they're, improving their industry and improving, their capability to produce more, which employs more people, garners more investment, more revenue for the government, more services, and so on. I mean, it's one lens to view it, but at the same time, right, you would also get sort of the protectionist, nationalist argument that, well, we've gutted the national industry. The Rust Belt is the Rust Belt for a reason. We aren't making things in America anymore. There was a comedian in the UK, I think, where he just made the comment like, we used to make steel, and we don't do that anymore, which can leave you vulnerable again to this thing. So it's sort of that push and pull. I can't say that it's a very reliable truism. I think that has sort of an ideological bent if you're more for the liberal globalized trade. But it doesn't mean that we haven't seen a significant reduction in conflict. I mean, in Europe, right, the liberal sort of functionalist argument would be like, well, the European community, now the EU, has led to this open exchange of goods and people, and the European states aren't going to war with each other anymore.
Can you actually view it the other way around, though, that the existence of trade, it might be more of a signal of the good relations between two countries?
Well, yeah, of course. I mean, you could argue that, but it also comes down to power imbalance as well. I mean, you could say that, the United States and Mexico have a great relationship because they have this United States, Mexico, Canada trade agreement, and that a lot of American auto manufacturing, in the maquiladoras south of the border, employs a lot of Mexicans, and at the same time, we get our cars relatively cheap, and there isn't any tariffs or any import duties that we have to deal with. But at the same time, that we can't exclusively rely on trade because we can trade very closely with other countries like we do with China, for example. But at the same time, the United States and China have vastly different geopolitical goals that they want for the rest of the world. And that they trade. They're some of the largest trading partners on Earth, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're in good relations with one another.
But they haven't gone to war, so maybe it does.
Well, maybe it does, but at the same time, I mean, the United States, since really the Obama administration with the pivot to Asia, has noticed that, okay, we have this trade relationship, but we're also dealing with intellectual property theft, currency manipulation. They're using American colleges to spy on American tech and then, sort of copy paste what we're doing here. So despite this trade relationship, we still have all these other problems that are going on. And so, well, why don't we help build up our military, partners in, say, South Korea or Japan? Why don't we create this thing called the Quad with, I believe, South Korea, the United States, Australia, and India, geographically right next to China, and, a population of 1.2 billion people. Why not we try and strengthen our political and strategic relations with one another? So even though, and I think that the other thing that while we haven't gone to war, it's that, well, there's also the concept of mutually assured destruction. China and the United States are nuclear armed states. So the idea of a conventional war may not be possible. So we're conducting it by other means like trade wars or espionage.
So then maybe that's another thing. So we've talked about the properties of bits of the map. We've talked about the things, the trade of goods and services and money. How about trying to get an analysis of the military strength of a country, and also a measure of its kind of potential. For example, if it's an industrial superpower that could produce dozens of tanks a day, or I don't know if even dozens would be a large number, but if you can outproduce in the case of a war. So in trying to sort of mentally game out, were a conflict to happen, would these two be equally matched? So I've often heard analysis along the lines of, well, the US spends more on its military than the next 20 countries put together. So obviously the US is going to win any war that it engages in. But that's just number of dollars spent. Isn't there a potential for the money to be spent inefficiently? And so what's a better metric?
Sure, and that's actually a really good point, is that also that statistic about how much money the US has spent between the last 27 countries also happened to happen at the same time that the United States was actively engaged in 2 military conflicts in the Middle East. So of course spending is going to be much higher. So there's also been, they've also started to see sort of the post-war numbers, and it's like, oh, it's not as nearly as high as it once was, which has some people concerned.
I never thought of that.
Yeah, something to keep in mind. But it's a good question, because yes, that money can be spent inefficiently. And the same reason why there's been a lot of criticism about the Pentagon, for example, about how it really hasn't managed to survive any audit or financial review that it's undergone. So there's argument that yes, the money can be spent inefficiently. And there was a really good article, I believe, in the American Affairs Journal right before sort of the evacuation of Afghanistan, called Data-Driven Defeat, that sort of talked about how money was being spent on all of these sort of strategic organizational goals about how do we do this to accomplish that in order for X, Y, and Z to occur, and not, well, what is the win condition? So yeah, money can definitely be spent inefficiently or ineffectively. At the same time, when it goes back to like, how do we pay attention to certain countries? We obviously know that others are more powerful than others. You should always, of course, be paying attention to nuclear armed states first. They're kind of going to be the ones that are the power brokers, because if one of them decides to press the red button, I'm of the belief that there's no concept of a limited nuclear exchange. I hope that I will never ever live to see that be tested, but you would pay attention to them first. And then you would start taking a breakdown of how many, what is their equipment? Is their training considered good? Where are they getting trained by? Where are they buying their weapons from? And those things will play a role, not just within the military strength, but also in their relationship to other countries. So when the United Nations had that General Assembly condemnation of Russia, and there were numerous nations that had, abstained. India is a good example. They abstained because in 2018, for example, they bought the S-400 missile system. From 2017 to 2020, like 65% of their equipment and armaments came from the Russians. So of course you want to maintain a good relationship with the country that you're buying weapons from, as well as trading, very cheap, like $30 some odd a barrel for oil, while the rest of the world is sanctioned Russian oil and natural gas, or at least the Western world, I should say. So military strength, it can be changed also based on strategy. Where are they putting their money into? Are the equipment that they're spending it in, is it still valid as a tactic in the 21st century? I mean, America has the world's largest group of aircraft carriers, and we have yet to see how tested or how provable that the use of aircraft carriers would be in a 21st century conflict.
I remember hearing a theory of war that the most moral, the sort of most justifiable type of conflict was one in which you intended to win completely and as quickly as possible. So you would sweep in, take everything over, and anything else is kind of morally inexcusable. Do you think a doctrine like that can exist in a world of where sort of moral qualms mean you lose potentially? Like you what I'm saying is that a valid analysis? Does anybody play by that kind of rule?
I do think that a lot of is sort of borrowed from elite theory, that a lot of our reasoning or ideological arguments or political ideologies, some of it can be post hoc rationalization for why we're moving into things. We can talk about wanting to make, with the interest of, say, Woodrow Wilson and the claim that we're going to make the world safe for democracy, even though clearly Woodrow Wilson and sort of his compatriots had other interests for getting involved in the First World War. And but it gives you a very good sort of ideological casus belli to engage in other countries. But I think in today, right, where we examined that, nation states, that we want to, say, take over or engage in conflict with, there's also other companies to deal with. There are other interests. There's other state dollars. I don't know how likely that could be in such an interconnected system that we're in now. I mean, you have, say, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization or the CSTO, the sort of Russian post-Soviet equivalent. You have other various economic blocs that might object to that kind of concept, whether it's like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization or, Mercosur in South America. So I don't know how possible that could really be when everyone else is going to be affected. They may wish to intervene to pursue their own economic or security interests. I do think that a lot of the, reasons that we're told that we get involved in things, I do think that that's, at least in a democratic system, right, it kind of goes back to Lippmann and Bernays about manufacturing consent sometimes.
I guess the kind of thing that the moral idea I was putting forward would prevent is deliberately choosing to just go and occupy somewhere for really long, like 20 years of sitting in Afghanistan, and that was your plan from the beginning, would just be unacceptable. It's like either you own that territory as part of your country, or like as a colony or whatever, or you don't get involved. And I wonder if the fact that we don't see people acting that way is because they are, different question.
Okay.
Related question. But do you think that it's fair to give the benefit of the doubt for decisions that are made about military conflicts, that at least they're not stupid? Like, you see a lot of people sort of rolling their eyes at military maneuvers being pulled, but I always feel like it would be surprising if these decisions were being made missing information that was available by a quick Google, or flippantly without much care, or without due attention. But do you think stupidity exists of that level in a military context?
Well, as someone who's not in the military and hasn't served, I don't want to disparage anyone who is or works in planning. I do think sometimes that, we may get so one-tracked on an objective that other things can be taken without context, or, taken in a totally different context, which is why I always ask people of different backgrounds to give me that answer. I know that this sounds like sort of a cop-out answer, but it's just I'm not the expert. I'm not one who works in the military, so I really couldn't
sounds
tell
like
you.
You're saying yes, stupidity could exist, but I'm not prepared to say
it. Well, I can definitely say that. Yeah, stupidity does exist, and people make blunderous decisions all the time. But I think that when these decisions are made, they're probably made not thinking, yes, I am an idiot, and I'm going to go forward and move on and march as an idiot. They're probably thinking, okay, with the information that we've planned out, based upon our doctrines, based upon all this is the correct move. Or and sometimes, again, it goes back to that question: are they, just high on their own supply, or they know what they're doing, or do they genuinely believe in what the sort of motivating ideology, political theology that it may be? And so for some military adventures in the past in history, I would say that, it's definitely true that there were some very dumb decisions that were made, but others probably were thinking, no, we've made these with the best, goals that we've had in mind. It just didn't play out the way that we did. And what's the first casualty of war? It's always the truth, and it's always your plan, your strategy.
How much do personalities matter For example, we read in history of these enormously successful military leaders who seem to have, by sheer force of personality, led to a change on the map of incalculable scale that just ricochets down history. Is that still possible today?
I think that there's the possibility and room for great men, and that we want great men. I think that that's a natural part of sort of the human condition when there's conflict. I mean, when this whole thing with Ukraine had brought out, I mean, we were already looking for these heroes to attach ourselves to, even if they were made up, and you had congressmen retweeting Sam Hyde memes about Ghost of Kiev. But I mean, even when we always try to make a hero, we always try to make great, competent men and leaders. During the first Gulf War, the United States had Schwarzkopf, Storm and Norman. It was sort of the nickname that it was given to him. So I think that we look for those men, and I think that they're very possible, especially when now things. I mean, the idea of organizing a military, the logistics, an army moves on its stomach and things like that. I think those are some age-old truths to where, I mean, we still teach Sun Tzu and Clausewitz in war colleges. So I think that these great men of the past clearly have inspired great men of today. And there may be generals and leaders that come out of conflicts, in this conflict that we see right now, or in conflicts of the future, that will be having their works and their strategies that are going to be memorialized and idealized of the past. I'm an adherent to the great man theory of history. So yes, my answer is naturally inclined to be yes.
Yes. So if my question is, do you hold to your own beliefs? It was essentially my question. You said yes. Okay, great. Well, good to clarify. Yeah. If you were to pick the top, well, let's start with top five. Top five countries that are the most important to get to grips with in the world. Which would you pick?
Top five that people should be paying attention to. Okay.
Yeah.
In no particular order, but I will name five because sort of what they do will vary on your day-to-day to prioritize. The United States, China, Germany, Saudi Arabia, and Russia. This list will change day by day because you're talking about global powers. I list these off because of the size of their economies. Most of them are nuclear armed states. Others are part of organizations like OPEC. If you were to ask me tomorrow, I might tell you that India should be on that list. Israel might be on that list. All of these, it will vary, but I would say that if you have a good understanding of how nations like Germany, which is primarily, leading the charge with the European Union project, you have a good idea of what they're doing. The Russians with their own idea. There are so many avenues to view the world, but I think that that would be a good start, especially with some of the economic power players and blocks. But that's also a very Western-centric analysis. If, for instance, if I were East Asian, if I were a Japanese person, I might say that you might want to pay attention to places like South Korea, Japan, China, India, Australia. My take would vary day by day based upon geography, who I am as a person, and so on, which is why I would recommend Samuel P. Huntington's Clash of Civilizations, because each person is going to view things differently. As an American, my viewpoint might be a little bit different than, say, someone like Nicholas Aldo, who's not an American, has his own perspectives and views, even though himself calls himself a neo-realist. So your background will, of course, inevitably bias your takes.
Yeah, and that totally fits with what you said at the top of the stream about why we should be paying attention to these things. I'm surprised out of that list, the one that I was most surprised by was Saudi Arabia. Why Saudi Arabia?
Primarily due to their relationship in terms of OPEC is one of the largest oil producing countries on earth. They kind of told the United States off recently because they're like, listen, whatever you do with Russian sanctions for oil and natural gas, we're not going to increase production because Russia is part of sort of OPEC+1, which is the Russia is an oil producing nation. Not to mention they're an exporter of the Wahhabist Islamist ideology, which has played a role in the creation of various terrorist groups, including ISIL and ISIS and all that. And that plays a role in their relationship with Israel, with Lebanon, all the countries within the Arabian Peninsula, while at the same time, they're sort of backed by the United States, and their greatest rival immediately in the area is that of Iran, which is backed by the other power players I mentioned, like China and Russia. So Saudi Arabia plays a substantial amount of importance in the Gulf region in the Middle East. So whatever the way Saudi Arabia goes, you can kind of get an idea of where these conflicts or these policies might lie within the Arab world.
I just looked up Saudi Arabia on a map, and I had no idea it was that large. For some reason, I thought it was a lot smaller. But there you go. That's one of those.
And not to mention, right, that Mecca and Medina are there, so it's also sort of like the epicenter of the holy world of Islam.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. We've hit an hour, so I want to give you a last chance to bring up anything else on the topic that you think is important to say. Maybe any other aspects of geopolitics that we've just completely left unaddressed.
I would always say that when studying these things, it's always best to get an on-to-the-ground perspective. I know I mentioned it earlier, but I cannot emphasize enough that you are never going to know everything. You are never, unless you dedicate yourself to one niche subject for the rest of your life, even then you probably won't know it all. And I will never claim to be an expert on anything. This is just what I talk about, what I studied in college. And that if you have someone that is willing to say, hey, I'm from here and here's what's going on, or here's how we view it, it's immensely helpful. I have a channel member who's from Egypt who sent me a long email saying, here's how the wheat issue is going to affect my country, and here's how your take might be changed by this information. And I can't begin to express how thankful I am for that. And on the subject of like the stream title itself, the world doesn't pause. I think that it applies not just to international relations itself, but I think that it becomes very easy for us, whether you're talking about geopolitics or talking about anything, that it becomes very easy that if you're focused on one issue the whole time, the world doesn't pause. The world is still spinning. Other things are still going on, and that you should be mindful of that, because even though we, whether we're talking about our content or what we do, other things are still going to be happening all over the place. And it's very easy to get bombarded with information and kind of go into a content creation or paralysis of analysis, sensory overload. But it's always important to just sort of take a step back, take a breather, pray, and get your bearings, because there'll be times where it's like, well, why haven't you talked about this? And it's like, well, simple. I don't know enough yet, and I don't feel it would be right for me to talk about it. I don't want to go in half-cocked. So, and that applies not just to what I talk about, but I think anything that we talk about. I mean, there's so much going on in the world that we kind of forget, hey, that there are things right outside your door that you could talk to. Like, have you broke bread with your neighbor? Have you called your mother today? Those, like, the basic things, that you should be doing as a human being. That for us online, it gets so easy to say that, hey, the world isn't pausing. Look at all these things I can doom scroll through on my phone. But you should probably turn the phone off for a day, talk to your family, things like that. That's why I mean, like, the world doesn't pause. Of course it doesn't, but doesn't stop you from paying attention to the things that really do matter. Your dog, your family, your loved ones.
Wow. Well, I hope you don't feel like that was all too much of learning the basics, because for me, that was essential. Like I feel I've got a much better foundation for this whole topic. But I'm sure for you it was, bread and butter.
Well,
and what I basically took
every Sunday I talk about this, so it's no big deal at all.
But so the only way to truly understand the current state of international relations is to subscribe to Prudentialist's YouTube channel. We could have shortened the whole stream down. just trust Prude.
Every Sunday at 4 p.m. Eastern, you can learn a little bit more about what's going on in the world. I have one out for you all today about Lebanon, but I won't have anything next week because it's Pascha.
Ah, yes, very good. Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for joining me. And I'm going to close out the stream by reading the next passage from the Passion narrative. After the Sabbath, at dawn, on the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary went to look at the tomb. There was a violent earthquake, for an angel of the Lord came down from heaven, and going to the tomb, rolled back the stone and sat on it. His appearance was like lightning, and his clothes were white as snow. The guards were so afraid of him that they shook and became like dead men. The angel said to the woman, "Do not be afraid, for I know that you are looking for Jesus who was crucified. He is not here. He has risen, just as he said."